The bottom line is that countries like Russia and China, Iran, North Korea, engage in aggressive and sophisticated efforts, both inside our country and abroad, to undermine the security, the economic interests, and the democratic institutions of our country, as well as those of our allies.
Hello and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm David Ignatius, a columnist for the Post. Today, on September 11, I'm pleased to be joined by Matt Olsen, who is the Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the Department of Justice. Matt, welcome to Washington Post Live.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me.
So, Matt, this is a solemn anniversary, 23rd anniversary of the attacks on September 11 that killed 3,000 or more Americans. The nation celebrated the anniversary this morning, remembered the anniversary with a reading of the names of the dead at Ground Zero in New York. In our conversation, we're going to talk about the continuing issues of terrorism and combating it. And I want to begin by asking you the obvious question that our viewers ask themselves and would ask you. Are we still vulnerable to terrorist attacks in the United States? And what do you see today as the biggest terror threats to the United States?
You know, I do appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with you, David, on on this day. In fact, I'd note that the Attorney General for us in the Department of Justice held a solemn ceremony this morning at 9 o'clock, and we had a moment of silence. So the question is front of mind for all of us today. I will say it is front of mind for us in the National Security Division and our counterparts at the FBI every day. Look, I do think that we continue to face a very complex and dynamic threat landscape when it comes to terrorism. You know, I've been doing this for a long time. I was the director of the National Counterterrorism Center 10 years ago. And I would say that the threat landscape from terrorism is as complicated and challenging as it has been during any of the years that I've worked on this challenge over the past 20 years, in part because it is so diversified. So we have really three vectors from which we face terrorism threats. There's the international side, where ISIS and Al Qaeda, while degraded, continue to pose a threat and continue to be determined to carry out an attack against the United States. We face state sponsors of terrorism, foremost among those, of course, is Iran. And then we face threats from within the United States, from domestic terrorism. And so from all of those vectors, we are concerned. For me, to answer your question, the biggest challenge we face, and I think this is a position that the intelligence community, the FBI, all agrees on, and that is that there are challenges posed by lone actors or very small cells, potentially inside the United States, that are very difficult for us to counter. And the reasons are, briefly, these individuals can be radicalized very quickly. They can typically be radicalized online using encrypted ways of communicating. And of course, inside the United States, they have easy access to military grade weapons. And these are just very difficult individuals for us to prevent from carrying out an act of terrorism. So I think that's, to me, the biggest challenge, which is, I think, in contrast to what we faced on 9/11, which is a much more complex type of plot hatched over many years, but still one that's very concerning and potentially quite lethal.
So, Matt, to take a specific issue, FBI Director Chris Wray last spring began warning about, as he put it, all the warning lights flashing red, and in particular talked about the threat of attacks on the homeland by the group ISIS-K, a spinoff of the Islamic State. Many of its operatives were driven from Afghanistan and went to Tajikistan and other neighboring countries, and there was concern that as ISIS-K Tajik immigrants had struck both at Russia and Iran, they might be preparing to strike the United States. Let me ask you specifically, are you tracking potential ISIS-K operatives? Is there a facilitation network that you've uncovered that helped people get into the United States? Do you feel you've disrupted operations by this group to keep the country safe?
It's an important question, and of course, mentioning ISIS-K as you identified, a splinter group from the Islamic State that has found some degree of safe haven in Afghanistan, and that does have the intention to carry out external attacks, including external attacks inside the United States, and as you mentioned, also has carried out attacks in Russia and Iran. And so, yes, very concerned about the capacity of ISIS-K to potentially move operatives into the United States. I would say, again, every day I sit with the FBI director, the attorney general, other FBI officials, and the number one concern around the table every morning is, are there individuals in the United States, regardless of whether they're coming from the southern border, the northern border, or any other way into our country? And what can we do about that? What disruption options do we have? And in fact, as I think you all have reported at the Washington Post and you've written about, David, there were a group of individuals who were arrested over the summer on immigration charges. Those individuals were the coordination was between the Department of Homeland Security, ICE, and the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force in conducting that operation to put those folks behind bars on immigration charges. And I would just say that this is something that we are focused on consistently, with the FBI leading the way on its terrorism investigations through its Joint Terrorism Task Force. I don't think there's as I've been in this business, there's not an organization in the world better equipped or more dedicated to taking on the terrorism threat than the FBI.
So we have a question from a member of our audience that goes specifically to the arrests that you mentioned, and I just want to press you for a little further. This question is from Eric Schmidt in Virginia. He asks, how serious of a terrorist threat does the recent arrest of 8 Tajik men who entered the United States through the southwest border represent? Were they directed by the Islamic State or inspired by that extremist group? And let me amplify that, Matt. Have you found any indication that their travel to the United States was facilitated by anyone in Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, or nearby who has any connection with ISIS-K?
Yeah, David. So I think you probably can appreciate, as can your listeners and readers. I'm not going to talk specifically about that investigation or any investigation, that's ongoing for that matter. I would reiterate just how significant we take this concern about individuals potentially entering the country. You put your finger on a very important distinction. That there is a distinction between those individuals who are directed by a group like ISIS-K versus those that are inspired. We've seen ISIS, for example, over the years since its rise in 2014, really use propaganda to inspire people who are already here to carry out attacks. But probably on the hierarchy, the biggest concern has to do with those who are directed to carry out attacks. I would point you to what happened really just very recently in the last several days. We announced the charges against an individual, a Pakistani national, seeking to enter the country from the north, from Canada, intent on carrying out a terrorist attack on behalf of ISIS in New York City, targeting the Jewish community and doing so in the name of ISIS. Now, that's an example both of the threat we face, but I think it's also a pretty good example of how we take on a threat like that. Our folks in the FBI, our prosecutors in New York, worked very closely with Canadian authorities. We brought those charges based on the information and evidence we had, and then Canada effected the arrest before that individual could enter the United States. So it's an example of, a lone actor intent on carrying out a terrorist attack and that challenge, but also the effectiveness of our partnerships with countries like Canada and others that help us take on this threat.
Just want to drill down on our audience members' question. I thought I heard you say in response to the question that the investigation of the 8 Tajiks is a continuing investigation. In other words, you've not concluded your efforts in that regard. Is that right?
Well, I think the main point is that they're still undergoing and facing charges. At least the individuals I mentioned that were arrested on immigration charges. So, because of the pending nature of those charges, I'm obviously not going to be able to talk about that.
So let's pull the camera back a little bit. Uh, we noted at the outset that this is September 11, a solemn date for our country. You have done a series of counterterrorism jobs. You headed the National Counterterrorism Center. I want to ask you on this anniversary date, what you, as a member of what I'm going to call the CT generation, national security professionals who focused on this, what you've learned and taken away. What are your own personal? What's the Matt Olsen list of lessons 23 years later?
Yeah, that's so. I do think. Look, think about what we've invested in counterterrorism over the past 20 plus years, and rightly so, given the nature of the threat. The level of effort from from our military, but also from our law enforcement and diplomatic communities, the amount of money we've spent, the lessons that we've learned. And for me, there are a few key lessons and takeaways I think that I think are overarching when it comes to the CT fight. One is, and we learned this the hard way after 9/11, that was the importance of information sharing. If you remember, and folks who of our generation, David, we remember that the problem was the FBI, fundamentally, and the CIA hadn't shared information effectively before 9/11. I've seen that issue largely be addressed. The idea of not sharing information is not acceptable when it comes to counterterrorism today. And I see every day us effectively working with the intelligence community and with our partners overseas. So, and that's a second real lesson, and that is that this is an effort that requires all of our elements of national power, as well as our close relationships with our allies around the world. So we work extremely closely with our allies in Europe, but also with partners in the Middle East to take on this challenge. Um, and I've also just would emphasize, I guess the third lesson is we use every tool. There were times when people would talk about this challenge right after 9/11 as either law enforcement or a military one. And I think we've gotten beyond that sort of false dichotomy and agreed upon a path forward that is, look, we're going to use whatever tool works, whether that's relying on our diplomats in the State Department, whether it's relying on the military, or at times the best option is going to be the FBI arresting somebody who's in the United States. And whatever the right tool is to take on the challenge, I think everyone agrees that that's how we should approach this. And so those are at least a few of the lessons that I've learned. And I would say that those lessons actually, when I look at some of the other threats we face, whether it's in cybersecurity or the nation state threats we face, those lessons apply more broadly across the broad range of threats facing the country today.
We're going to look at some other terrorism cases that have risen in the last several years, but I want to ask you to look ahead to national security challenge in the future. I wrote last week that the White House is just finishing work on the National Security Memorandum on AI. I'm sure that you at the Justice Department helped contribute to that. The essence of that memorandum, NSM as they call it, is the idea that the United States should seek to preserve and extend its current lead in AI technologies as a matter of national security. So I want to ask you what that's going to mean for the Justice Department, for the FBI. What are the challenges specifically that are going to be involved in preserving and extending that American primacy?
It's a really important question today, with the importance of artificial intelligence. And I think, again, just sort of stepping back, I think the way we think about artificial intelligence from a threat perspective is that it's basically like an accelerant. It can change the capacity of our adversaries on a whole range of threats, whether that's cybersecurity, using using AI as for disinformation when it comes to election interference, for example, or other types of foreign malign interference. So it's best understood, I think, as a potential real accelerant of all the different threats that we face. So when it comes to the Justice Department, one area where we're very focused, and that is an answer to your question, and that is preventing the transfer of artificial intelligence technology from the United States to our adversaries. So much of what we talk about when we talk about artificial intelligence and some of the hardware that is behind artificial intelligence capabilities is controlled under our laws, under our export control laws, designed specifically to preserve our primacy in some of these areas and to prevent these technologies that can be very dangerous from falling into the hands of some very dangerous countries and very dangerous people. So we actually have a strike force called the Disruptive Technology Strike Force, working with U.S. attorneys around the country, the FBI, and the Commerce Department to stop the flow of sensitive technologies. And at the top of that list, our top priority is stopping the flow of technologies relating to artificial intelligence from going to Russia, to China, to Iran. And so at least for our part at the Justice Department, one of the ways that we can preserve our primacy and defend our ability to lead on AI is to stem the flow of those technologies, which our adversaries are trying to obtain all the time, and stop them from actually getting a hold of those technologies.
So, Matt, given that those technologies really are driven by our private companies, our five dominant AI companies lead the world. It sounds like you're going to need very close cooperation from those companies if you're going to be able to protect these essential technology secrets. In effect, are you confident that that's going to happen? These companies have often been reluctant to work with the government.
I am confident. We've had some really strong partnerships and good experiences in our efforts to reach out to companies and work with them, and make sure that they understand what the laws required, make sure that they have strong compliance programs to prevent the flow of sensitive technologies outside the country. I don't think these companies look. I mean, not every company, is pleased to see the federal government, in the first instance, but the kind of companies that we're talking about, who are leading the AI revolution, as well as other technologies companies, those that are building, the revolutionary sort of computer chips that are so important to our economy. And these companies are quite willing to work with us. They do not want their products going to our adversaries. And I mean, one example that I would just point to that we're very intent and very focused on right now is stopping the flow of microelectronics outside of the United States through transshipment countries to Russia. So Russia is trying to obtain microelectronics to fuel its war in Ukraine. And companies in the United States understand the dangers that poses and are very willing to work with us and have worked with us on preventing the flow of those types of that type of hardware that ends up obviously going right into Russian missiles and Russian drones that are killing innocent people in Ukraine. So I think when you make that case to American CEOs and technology leaders, I think they understand, and I think we've had a really good experience working with them.
I want to ask you about some cases that our viewers may not be familiar with. The first involving Iranian operations. FBI, Justice Department indicted a Pakistani named Asif Reza Merchant who had traveled to Iran. And according to the evidence that's in the legal pleadings, he was on a mission to avenge the death of the leader of the Quds Force, Qasem Soleimani, in 2021, or 2020, I think. And according to the documents, had threatened to kill a former national security advisor that had been part of the overall plot. How do you, as head of the National Security Division, deal with what appears to be an effort by Iran to conduct assassination operations on U.S. soil against people who were residing here, who in some cases held very prominent positions.
Yeah, so David, I appreciate you bringing attention to this issue. I know you've written about this just last month in the Washington Post. It is really quite shocking when you look at what the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and the Quds Force are looking to do in seeking to carry out assassination plots inside the United States. So, as you mentioned, the most recent example that we have of plotting inside the United States, this individual named Merchant, who was arrested last month and was actually indicted today, or the indictment was announced today. It was returned yesterday, charging him with a murder for hire plot and terrorism charges. He is linked to Iran, and he is charged with seeking to carry out an assassination of a former American officials. This charge really is the latest in what has become an Iranian playbook of targeting American former officials. As you mentioned, the stated goal is to avenge the death of Qasem Soleimani. And we've seen a number of instances where we in the Justice Department, working with our partners at the FBI, have charged individuals with plotting to kill former officials. One of the examples being an individual named Safi, and for seeking to carry out the assassination of the former national security advisor. That's on top of Iranian plotting, not against former officials, but against Iranian dissidents, people who are opposed to the Iranian regime, but similar tactics, seeking to identify people in the United States who are willing to carry out these plots, often for money, and ones that, time and time again, we have charged individuals for being involved in this activity. And I think, to your question, it's really hard to overstate the significance of and how shocking it is that Iran would seek to assassinate individuals in the United States, and especially when it comes to our former officials, but also when it comes to dissidents. These are people who are speaking out and exercising their rights as people inside the United States under the First Amendment to speak their mind, and they've been targeted for assassination by the Iranian regime, which, as I mentioned at the top, is the foremost sponsor of terrorism among the world of nations.
So in the time we have left, I want to focus, Matt, on operations inside the United States by Russia. And I want to begin not with cyber, which we'll get to, but with assassination attempts or attempts to use violence by Russian operatives inside the United States. As we know, GRU operatives tried to kill a Russian living in Salisbury, England, Sergei Skripal. They succeeded in killing a Russian named Litvinenko some years before that. There is considerable reporting in our paper and others about a campaign led by the GRU of sabotage across Europe, attacking people and warehouses and other facilities involved in supporting Ukraine. I want to ask you whether the Russians, as you look at the evidence, are considering or conducting operations like that in the United States, where they would use lethal force against Russian defectors, against others in the United States who were targets.
Yeah, look, we're very concerned about the GRU in particular. That's the Russian military intelligence arm, and obviously are working closely with our partners in Europe, where you've identified a number of plots carried out by Russian intelligence, whether it's plots to cause damage to buildings, or more, all the more serious and concerning, going after individuals who they believe to be, enemies of the Kremlin. So it's an area of extreme concern. We've seen with our cases, in one particular case, an individual who actually pled guilty in 2022 to conducting surveillance of someone he believed was a dissident on behalf of what he believed was a Russian intelligence officer. So we've seen some of that, what we call transnational repression, where one country seeks to carry out repressive activities inside of our country or outside of their own borders. So we've seen some of that activity. We haven't seen, I think, the same level of GRU activity as of today inside the United States. But I am not sanguine on that, and I think I think your listeners and readers should rest assured that this is an area of high degree of concern among the FBI and our intelligence community, as well as those of us here at the Justice Department.
So, Matt, one area where the GRU and other Russian intelligence organizations have been very active in the United States, according to Justice Department filings, is in trying to disrupt our elections. We all remember the evidence from 2016, continuing through 2018, 2020. I want to ask you about the current evidence. Last week, the Justice Department announced that it was disrupting a Russian influence organization that it called the Doppelganger operation that was trying to spread Russian propaganda through various channels. I want to ask you to explain to our viewers what that investigation revealed, and as the November election approaches, what people should expect the Russians may try to do to disrupt the elections and influence the outcome.
Yeah, David, I among the various threats that we are concerned about and that you and I have spoken about over the past 30 minutes or so, it's hard to imagine one that's more concerning in the current moment as we approach the election than the challenge of foreign election interference. And among the countries, it includes Russia and as well as Iran and China. But Russia in particular has proven itself to be extremely determined to interfere in our elections. Our leaders of the intelligence community are sounding the alarm. The director of national intelligence put out a statement about this. The FBI director talked about this just a few days ago. Look at what we're seeing from Russia is an extremely determined and somewhat sophisticated effort to interfere in our elections in ways that they think will serve their national interests. I think for our part at the Justice Department, our goal is to really call this out, and that's what we did last week in announcing two separate cases. One involving an effort by so-called what used to be called Russia Today, or RT, to work through an intermediary, a company in Tennessee, to put out propaganda that would support Russia's national interests, in particular, sort of downplaying or seeking to downplay support in the United States for Ukraine. The case you talked about, you mentioned Doppelganger. That was an instance where we seized 32 domains, internet domains that were being used to put out Russian propaganda tied directly to the presidential administration, the Kremlin. Directions coming from the Kremlin to interfere in our elections, in part by spoofing legitimate news outlets, including the Washington Post, Fox News, and others. But if you look at what they put out, it looks just like a Washington Post website, and then it contains flat out made up Russian propaganda intended for U.S. audiences, intended to interfere in our elections and affect how we think about policy issues that are actually the ones that we care about as Americans. So our job at the Justice Department is to shine a light on that, to make sure that voters are informed when they get information, that they know if it's coming from a foreign source, that foreign source is identified. I mean, that's the way that we are able to support free and fair elections. And of course, those free and fair elections and an informed electorate are the pillars of our democracy. So that's why I feel like this is such a significant issue going into the next 60 days or so as we approach the presidential election.
So that's a chilling warning. This is the third presidential election in a row that has been subject to direct, carefully orchestrated Russian interference. It's probably a point, Matt, at which we should end our conversation. I want to thank you for joining us on September 11, a special day for you and all the people you work with. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, David. I really enjoyed it.
So we hope you'll join us for other programming. The way to do it is to subscribe to Washington Post. You can get started by getting a free trial. Visit WashingtonPost.com/live. Take a look, and we hope you'll join us as a subscriber. Thanks for being with us today.